And welcome everybody. Lovely to be back here again, back with Martin. We're diving back into the Gospel of John. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at chapter 14. I think we're intending to move on to chapter 15 today and see what we can gain out of that. I will just mention that if you happen to be watching live, you're very welcome to drop a comment in and a question. And I can put it up on screen. Martin and I can talk about that, and we'll see where we go. If not, if you're watching this as a recording, then please feel free again to put something in the comments, and we can throw a comment back out, or it may even guide us in what we cover in the future. So welcome, Martin. It's good to have you back with us.
Thanks, Dave.
Let's get into it. Hey,
be here. Okay, so last week, you remember we talked on John chapter 14, and we were talking about Jesus telling his disciples that he was going to prepare a place for them. And in looking at this chapter, we tried to look at what's called by Swedenborg the internal sense, or the inner sense of the Bible. And the reason that we know that the Bible has an internal sense is because it's read in heaven, and because heaven is different to this world that we live in, this natural material world that we live in. Your suggestion was different laws of gravity, I believe, David. That, like, the laws of gravity are different between this world and other planets, so that kind of law is different in heaven as well. And we pointed out that Jesus' suggestion that he was going to prepare a place for his disciples, place was not a term that people in heaven understand, because place in heaven is not ruled by distance, by traveling, but by affection, by how much a person wants to be in a particular part of heaven. And we recognize that that part of heaven was to do with the various things about the person that they had loved in their lifetime, particularly people and relationships. And I suggested the saying, distance is from affection. So in heaven, as much as you love someone, that's how close you are or far from them. So today we're going to look not so much at the internal sense as we looked at last time, but we're going to look at correspondences. Now, what are correspondences? Well, correspondences are the things that connect heaven and earth together. Now, it's interesting that the Apostle Paul understood this. In Romans 1:20, he wrote, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the heaven and earth through everything God has made. They can clearly see his visible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they've no excuse for not knowing God." But here Paul's not talking about a beautiful sunset or a stunning mountain view. What he's talking about is something far more detailed, even structured. He's pointing to the world we live in as a materializing out of heaven, or a flow out of heaven. And Swedenborg tells us in an extraordinary suggestion that heaven constantly flows into our world, and that if for even a moment that were to stop, our world would just completely disintegrate and disappear. So that's something to think about. Swedenborg expands on this idea by explaining that everything in the natural world corresponds to something in the spiritual world. He says that there are three types of correspondences: animal, vegetable, and mineral. Everything we see around us exists because of a constant flow from heaven into this world. But this isn't just a vague general flow or general influence. it's highly specific and highly detailed. It is a flow that communicates everything in heaven to everything in the world. And the reason for this is because this world originally came from heaven. This world is what I like to call a knockoff of heaven, a perfect copy of heaven, but in a less, in a very much less perfect way.
Yeah. So look, I just dive in. One of the things that makes me think of is we've got that in the book of Hebrews. You know, Paul talks about the shadow of things to come.
Yeah.
There's the knockoff.
Yeah, that's right. It's just a shadow. C.S. Lewis was a famous Christian author who once said that this world is to heaven as a picture of a rose is to a real rose. So everything exists and does so because of heaven. The world around us is almost like a giant living encyclopedia with pictures and moving images. And the reason for this world then, why has it been, as it were, taken out of heaven? Why has it been created as a copy of heaven? And the reason is that we can learn from this world. This world can tutor us in what's expected of us, and instruct us both about God and about ourselves. So let's take a closer look at this idea of animal, vegetable, and mineral. These are correspondences. Correspondences are connections between this world and the next world, the eternal world. Now, a really good place to look at correspondences is actually in Genesis chapter 1. First, we read in Genesis chapter 1 about the creation of the world, about water, and then about land. And that is what we could call the mineral part of correspondences. Then we know on the third and fourth day, second and third and fourth day, begins to talk about vegetation and how vegetation germinates and grows. And finally, on the fourth and fifth day, we look at animals, the creation of animals, and then eventually human beings. And that is the animal, vegetable, and mineral right there in those three stages. And the interesting thing about them, and the thing that makes knowing about correspondences so useful, is that these days of creation are not just, well, trees were built on this day and animals came into existence on this day, but they are actually you could call it an evolution, that trees are somehow necessary for the creation of animals which follow them. And of course, going even more deeper than that, we can know that all of these, that the creation of the world, as I said, is about us and God. And particularly, we can see, if we look at in the internal sense and in the correspondences that we can see in Genesis chapter 1, we can describe the process in a human being of creation taking place in the same way as the Bible communicates to us that it took place in the world. In other words, the creation of minerals, vegetables, and animals is not so much how this world came into existence, but how we come into existence. Swedenborg explains that these verses describe how a person is beginning to awaken spiritually. They start to sense that there's more to life than just the physical world around us. We become aware of a deeper interior part of ourselves. We hunger for knowledge about it. We want to know the truth about ourselves and about our lives. And we want to acquire knowledge. We want to learn and recognize what is true and genuinely useful.
Can I throw a comment in there?
Yeah.
Martin, is that okay?
Yeah.
So, yeah, this idea that the creation story maps out our spiritual development. This, to me, answers one of the big challenges about the story, which is why do the sun, moon, and stars appear on day 4, I think it is, off the top of my head, when you have light appearing on a day 1? It seems backwards, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Light appears, and then the source of light, as we experience it, appears. And for me, that suggests that our initial awakening is an awakening to the fact that there is a truth that is outside of ourselves. But then day 4 is not the creation of the source of that truth, but it's our awareness of the source of that truth, which is coming into, which is awakening in us. So that's my sense of what goes on there and why the sequence is kind of out in a way.
Well, of course, if that were about the creation of the world, it's ridiculous to think that plants would be able to survive without a sun.
Quite right. But there's something about the plants, about the mineral first of all the mineral, then the vegetable kingdom, that we need in place before we realize the presence of the divine.
It's truly amazing that so many people read Genesis chapter 1 and never see that simple contradiction, that the sun is created on the 4th day. So in this look today at correspondences leading on to John chapter 15, we're going to look at plants specifically, and the creation of plants, and we will lead on from there ultimately to the grapevine, which is what's spoken of, the correspondence that's mainly spoken of in John chapter 15. Let me just read this quote from Genesis chapter 1 verse 11. Let the land sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, trees that bear fruit with seed in them according to their kinds. Now here is the first verse to talk about the creation of plants. And Swedenborg tells us that this is not the knowledge of the world around us, but of the world within us, spiritual knowledge of what's happening inside of us. And it's repeated in verse 12, verse 11 and verse 12. It's repeated again. The land produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. Now, what do you notice about these two verses? What we talked about? Well, let's just jump to it. The interesting thing about both these verses and their discussion of the creation of plants is that there are 3 types of plants mentioned. There is vegetation. Now, vegetation, we use it in a general term, but in the Hebrew, it meant more leafy things. And then it mentioned seed-bearing plants, and then it mentioned fruit-bearing plants. You remember that we talked about the use of the number 3 in so much of the Bible, and here we have again in this verse, vegetation or leaves, seed-bearing plants, and fruit-bearing plants. And of course, these plants speak of a number of different things, in fact, hundreds of different things, but let's have a look at 3 examples of the 3 in the Bible. Obviously, the most famous one is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, which is one God, but there is a 3-ness about him. Also, we can talk, as we did in the last session, about good and truth and a life of kindness. The good in our heart, the truth in our minds, and the life that we live in the world, which comes from our heart and our mind within us. And we can look at love, faith, and service. once again, this is the threeness of life, which is also, of course, the threeness of God. Swedenborg unpacks this beautifully. He tells us that vegetation, the leaves, represent our first stirrings of interest in spiritual knowledge. This is what you were talking about a bit earlier, David. And truth. And seed-bearing plants represents those ideas that take root in us, sowing themselves in our mind, germinating and growing up. And fruit, of course, represents our lifestyle, or our kindness, our actions, choices, character that grow from these earlier stages. And if you think about these things carefully, you will recognize that, sowing seeds of thought is a saying that we use, or having a fruitful life is another saying. Being a fruitful kind of person. And of course, the stirrings of interest, the leaves which provide the energy for the whole plant, which are the first things to shoot up out of the ground from the seeds that are planted. These are, like I say, the original interest that takes place in us and leads to the rest. So now let's turn to John chapter 14, chapter 15 and 14 and have a look. At the end of John 14, Jesus makes a very ominous threat. The Prince of this world is coming, has no claim on me, because I do exactly what the Father has commanded me. Just let me have a break here. I might actually jump a little bit forward and come back to that. Okay.
Okay.
Is that okay, David?
Yeah, it's fine. Absolutely. Go for your life.
All right. In the Old Testament, we have a very short book written by one of the many prophets of Israel, whose name was called Habakkuk. Habakkuk was in Israel in a very bad time, and he is praying to God, we are told in the first chapter of this book. The Jews of his day were not very good, not very nice people. And Habakkuk was complaining to God about how terrible they were. Surprisingly, God answers him by telling him that God is going to punish the Jews of his day who were so bad. And he's going to do it by sending a powerful army to Israel to conquer Israel and to kill these evil people in it. Habakkuk, of course, is totally shocked by this solution of God. No, he says, no, you could never do that. That's a terrible thing. We can't do that. And proceeds to remind God, and here's a tip for you if you're ever dealing with God, the best way to get him to change his mind, which is what the Bible talks about, even though we know that God's mind can't really be changed. But the best way to talk to God is to remind God of how good he is, and how much he loves people, and how important it is that people see him as a good and loving God. And this is what Habakkuk did. Unfortunately, God has remained unmoved. He has committed himself to his decision with the evil people in Israel. And furthermore, he goes on to instruct Habakkuk to warn, to be the prophet, to warn the people of Israel that God was going to punish them in this way. Finally, at the end of the book of Habakkuk resigns himself to the inevitability of what God is going to do. And the reason that I'm talking about this prophet in particular is because at the end of the book, we have Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 17, which is many people have read, and songs have been written about this lovely little passage. And it goes like this: though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is found on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though sheep are not allowed into the fold, and cattle are not allowed into the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. And now this is, when you look at it, it's a very positive thing for Habakkuk to do, and it's the sort of thing that we should be encouraged to do. When everything seems bad, we just try to be as positive as we can and try to see whatever good we can find. Now, before we just look at this briefly, and we're looking at this briefly, I just want to make a very clear statement. God never gets angry. He never harms people. He doesn't send anyone to hell. He never prevents anyone from entering heaven. God is pure, absolute love. And despite everything that's just been said in the book of Habakkuk and in many other parts of the Bible, which we don't have time to unpack today, none of these evil things that are talked about are part of God. And we can't really go into it, but the best way to understand it is that in the literal sense, these words are spoken of and harshly given to us. But in the inner sense, in the spiritual sense, we understand that these things are how we feel inside of us about God. And the Bible is written for us to read and says these things about God because this is what we put onto God in our lives, although sometimes it might be hard to see yourself as doing that.
I'm just going to take opportunity, Martin, to throw in that our latest video, which was released yesterday, called God and Pigeons, is about this idea that there is what's termed an appearance, that the way we look at God in the Bible is not the way that God looks at us.
Yeah.
And why the Bible is written in that way. So if anybody's interested in having a look at that, say God and Pigeons is the name of that video.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, David. Yeah, God feels like judgment, especially those parts of us which are opposed to love and truth, and feels like someone who punishes. This is the way we interpret how God relates to us. But in reality, we are putting our own prejudices or biases onto God. That is not what He's like. Okay, let's look at this passage. Can you answer this question? What do these 4 plants and 2 animals have in common? All right, well, if you said the thing that connects these 4 plants, the fig tree, the 3 plants, no, sorry, 4 plants, the fig tree, the vine, and the olive, and the fields of wheat, these are the plants. The thing that connects them together is that they all are representatives of the church. Now, the fig tree, for example, you might remember Jesus entering Jerusalem one day and saw a fig tree and looked for fruit on it and couldn't find any. Even though it was in season, there was no fruit on the tree. So Jesus condemned this fig tree, and next time the disciples went by, they noticed that the tree had died. And we know that what Jesus was doing was giving a sign that Israel also was not bearing fruit, was not doing the things that they were meant to do to show up the kindness of their God, and that this was a warning to Israel that they would be wiped out, like the fig tree was. And indeed, history tells us that that's exactly what happened. Then we have the vine, and we're going to go into the vine a bit more deeply at the end of this session, so we'll just skip that for a moment. Then we have the olive branch, and the olive is a correspondent. The Jews got olive oil from the olive, which was used for anointing people, kings, And Paul, in another place in chapter 11, verse 17, talks about the Gentiles being grafted into the church among the Jews like a wild olive into a fruitful olive. That's in Romans 11, chapter 17. And then, of course, lastly, we have the fields and their harvest. And of course, there's that famous hymn, Bringing in the Sheaves. And the harvest in the Bible is talked about in the sense of people returning to God, people coming back to the Lord. And even today, we talk about the harvest out there that is waiting for us to send out people to reach it. And you'll often hear ministers, pastors talking about, going out into the field and harvesting it. Then we have two animals, of course. We have the sheep. We know sheep, of course, are talked about a lot. Lambs and sheep are talked about a lot. Jesus is called the Lamb of God. And this speaks to us. This is a correspondent for us of innocence. And then last of all, we have cattle. Cattle are cut off from the stall. And cattle speak, sheep speak of innocence, cattle speak of strength. And both of these are characteristics of the church. And so we can see here this incredible use of the things that we know in the world. And we call these things correspondences because they are so full of meaning and instruction to us.
Martin, can I just put in a question there?
Yeah.
So you're talking about the church. What do we mean by the church? What is it? Are we talking about a building? Are we talking about a particular organization? Are we talking about Christianity as a whole? What is it, this church that you speak of?
Okay, that's a great question, David. I'm glad you brought it up. What is the church? Well, the church builds a building to house it, but of course it is not the building, although often the buildings that churches build are very fancy. But the church is basically a group of Christians in this world which gather together to share with each other the love of the Lord and the truths of Jesus, and to encourage each other to do the work of the Lord. And wherever a group like this gathers together for those specific goals and that specific mission, they can regard themselves as a church. And Swedenborg really also goes on to say that even an individual can be a church in the same way as an individual can be heaven. And speaking of heaven, of course, the church, it really does act as a container of the inflow of heaven into the world. And those who do gather together, Christians who belong to churches, often say that one of the places they feel heaven most closely is in the church on Sunday. And if they are practicing the good things of heaven, and being a true church, not a false church, then definitely heaven can be felt by them in their midst.
So when you say that the church is not a building, it's something that's built by the church for activities that the church, engage in.
In the same,
that's right. In the same way, we can talk about an organization. It's a structure within which the church works, but the organization itself is not the church. And then you point out that Swedenborg talks about the church as being within the individual potentially. But the church is not the individual either. So it's a principle that kind of hovers above all of these physical manifestations, doesn't it?
It produces manifestations.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that. Let's look at James chapter 3, verse 12. My brothers, can a fig tree grow olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Here's another collection of these three plants that we're becoming familiar with. Now, let's have a look, before we go on any further, let's have a look at what are plants? Why were they created before, as we said earlier, the sun and the moon, but especially before animals and before men? Why were plants created earlier? And what role do they play in the scheme of, and in the idea of, the Genesis chapter 1, talking about not so much the creation of the world, but the creation of the world in us, of a living world rather than a dead world. Almost you could talk about of heaven in us, which is saying the same thing. And so if we were to place these plants in the order that they represent, we would start with the olive. It represents the knowledge or the knowing of the love of the Father. So let me just stop. Let me just pause for a moment and look for another way to say that. When we first come to the Word of God, when we first come to a realization of something happening inside of us that is deeper than what we've always known, which is just a natural world, the first way that we become familiar with these things in us is through knowledge. We learn about them. And so these three plants, because they're plants, they're speaking to us of the process of learning, first and foremost. So the olive tree represents the knowledge, learning of the Father, who is, of course, love. We looked at that last time. Then the second plant is the vine. And the vine represents the knowledge associated not with love, but with truth. And truth is distinctly different, of course, from love. Love is something that takes place in our heart. Truth is something that takes place in our mind. And I think one of the reasons for the amazing difference between the olive, which is a tree, and the vine, which is a vine, speaks of the difference between love and truth. They are distinctly different, but at the same time, they must come together, and God brings them together within us. He brings that which is of the heart and that which is of the will together with that which is of the mind and that which is of the understanding or intellect. He brings those things together. Now, they can never be mixed. They can never, as it were, become homogenized with each other. But they can be joined. And it's essential that they are two separate things joined together. Like I think I said last time, it's like an alloy of two different metals, like brass or other things, makes the final metal, the brass, stronger than the copper and the tin that would be without their mixing together. Copper, we know, is soft, and so is tin, but when we mix them together, I think it's tin. Is that right, David?
Oh, I'm not sure. Sorry, not up with my metallurgy. Sorry.
Anyway, they're both soft by themselves, but when they're mixed together into brass, they make a beautiful hard metal. and that is how we grow. We grow because of the love that God provides to us and of the truth, which is of a protection, which is a protection around that love. Psalm 104 verse 15, wine to gladden the heart of man, and olive oil to make his face shine. Wine to gladden the heart of man, and olive oil to make his face shine. Here is the vine and the olive coming together. John 15 verse 1, I am the true grapevine and my Father is the gardener. And so now we're looking back at John 15 and trying to apply these correspondences that we've been looking at, knowing that they're plants, and knowing the different roles that those plants play. So let's have a look then. John chapter 15 verse 1. I am the true grapevine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit and prunes the branches that do bear fruit so that they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me and I will remain in you, for a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot produce fruit or be fruitful unless you remain in me. I happen to live in a wine-growing district, and I know a little bit about the cultivation of vines to produce wine, and I therefore know that the first 4 verses of John 15 are exactly right when they talk about pruning a plant so that it will bear more fruit. This is what happens every year towards the end of summer when fruit has been picked. They prune the branches back quite harsh. The average grapevine is only about less than a metre tall. But the new branches, when they come in the following year and the following summer, can be up to many metres long, growing out sideways. But this passage does sound a little bit harsh. Does it sound a bit harsh to you, David?
I don't think I'd like to be pruned, I have to say. I'll pop it back up again. Here it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of pruning there, and it goes on, of course, to talk about him throwing the dead branches away if they don't produce any fruit.
Oh, and getting burnt, yes. Yeah, there's lots of judgment in this chapter, isn't there?
Yeah,
so it seems, anyway.
The talk of verse 18, the talk of pruning and burning branches that don't produce fruit make God sound very unkind and quite fierce.
Yeah.
There are many things. Yeah. So what is God talking about here? Well, we know that he's like a vineyard grower who is wanting to produce as much fruit as possible from each and every vine. And God, of course, wants to see, and of course you know exactly what I mean when I talk about bearing fruit. You know that there's a saying, by their fruits you will know them. And so we understand. It's interesting that we have a general understanding of what producing fruit in our lives means, and this is a classic example of what we call an unconscious correspondence. It's something that we just use and think about and talk about without ever realizing that the grapevine was designed to teach us this truth about what is taking place in us. And this is a fascinating thing when you first discover it, that there's all of these things around us every day. Most of them we're completely oblivious what they actually mean and what they actually indicate. And yet there are so many proverbs and images. Even my son loves the word tropes. A trope is a kind of correspondent, although a very superficial one. But to think that this world was created with these things in it which speak to us about ourselves and about God.
Well, our language is really embedded with this, isn't it? You know, we, as you say, it's unconsciously used, but we make reference to this in the way that we speak every day. If we just pay attention to what we say and why we say it and what we mean, we start to realize that these correspondences are actually embedded in the way we speak.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right, David. And in fact, some of these things you will actually find flow over into things like dreams and imaginations, and even into the world of cinema and writing, novel writing. You can find these things coming up. So it's not an exaggeration to say that we are saturated with these concepts, but without an understanding or an awareness of the meaning, without a name to put to them, we may never think. We may go through our whole lives without ever realizing the images and metaphors around us. Now we're just going to pop back to what we started with when we were looking at John chapter 14. Jesus begins by talking about.
Shall I go back to 14?
No, I don't think there's any point.
No need to? No, okay.
Yeah, it's the end of chapter 14 anyway, the transition. Jesus is talking about the devil or the evil one is coming, and how he's going to at the end of chapter 14, Jesus makes this very ominous threat. The prince of this world is coming. He has no claim on me because I do exactly what the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Come on, let's go. Let's leave here. Now Jesus is being very ominous at the end of this chapter. After talking to his disciples for a whole chapter about heaven, he suddenly gets quite dark. And why does he get dark? Well, actually, to understand that, we can actually know something else, which is, what is the point of us being in this world? Why do we need to spend 60 or 80 odd years living in this world with all its heartache and struggle? Why can't we just be born into heaven, have all the good stuff? And the answer to that is that there is evil in the world around us, but there is also evil within ourselves. And it is not just the evil in the world that that the Lord wants to change, but it is the evil in us too that he wants to change. And this is the what he's talking about in both chapters. And when Jesus talks about this pruning of the vine so that we might bear more fruit, what he's talking about is sometimes causing things to happen to us that we can we're just getting on a roll, we're just starting to do something really big, or you hear people talk about, I'm finally happy, finally after all the struggle and all the effort I've put in, I feel like I've arrived, and then they'll get hit by a bus or something like that. No, not really, but it's strange how often something comes along to trip them up when they start to feel like they've really made it. And the reason that this happens is because this world is not about getting everything we want. It's not about living happily ever after. That is not what this world is for. This world is a preparation for the real world, and the real world is the next world that we are invited into after we die. So maybe getting hit by a bus and dying is a good example of what happens to us in this life. So Jesus is interspacing in these two chapters. He's interspacing the love of God for us and the kindness and the help that God gives us with a warning. Let's not become too comfortable in this world and in this life, because this is not the end game. I like to say, living in this world is the dress rehearsal. It's not the play. The play is coming. The play is what we are practicing, what we are learning our lines, what we are repeating ourselves until we get it right. That is what we are heading towards. Not in this life is, as I say, about getting it right and doing better. And this is one of the biggest mistakes that so many people make in this life.
There's a couple of things that just strike me, Martin, about this. One is this idea that you're presenting. It invests what we regard as suffering with some meaning.
Absolutely.
There is some purpose behind it, although we, in the situations we find ourselves in, sort of really clutch at straws looking for some reason why we're going through what we're going through. We don't see the meaning and purpose of suffering. It feels pointless to us. But to hang on to this idea that, yes, there is a purpose, there is something here to be learned. Actually, just the simple acknowledgement that there is something to be learned in itself can be useful. The other thing that strikes me is I remember a quote by the Korean pianist Lang Lang. And he, what he says is, don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. And
that's a good way of putting it.
And it's all about finding that. It's finding a state, actually, where what is good just simply flows out of you and through you, and so we're no longer in that place where we can do those things that need to be taken away.
So throughout this chapter, Jesus says various things which remind us of this. He first of all, in verses 9 to 17, he reassures us that he loves us and that he will take care of us. But then then verses 18, he begins by saying, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. Verse 19, the world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it, but you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, and so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And if they'd listened to me, they would listen to you. But they do all of this to you because they have rejected me. So these are very clever words, because Jesus is simultaneously encouraging us by saying that he loves us and supports us, and then at the same time telling us that it is because Jesus loves us and supports us that the world hates us. We represent, you know, a threat to the world, and these are difficult things to deal with. And of course, as you were talking, David, I thought it's not just learning. This world is not just about learning. This is learning the truth, not taking place in the mind, but it's about changing. We need to change our hearts, and we need to change our lives. And so we have the change of heart, and then we have the learning, the laws of the Lord, and the love of God, learning about these things, and then we have the putting them into practice through a lifestyle of change. And of course, in finishing up, they have seen, Jesus says, if I hadn't done miraculous signs among them, then no one else could do, they would not be guilty. But that as it is, they have seen everything I did, yet they still hate me and my Father. This fulfills what is written. They hated me without cause. And they will hate us without cause. But then he finally finishes up with these lovely two verses, verse 26 and 27. But I will send you an advocate. What an interesting word, an advocate. What is an advocate? Well, an advocate is someone most commonly known as someone in court who sticks up for you, who defends you.
Counsel for the defense.
Counsel for the defense, exactly, David. And the Spirit of truth, the Holy Spirit, will come to you from the Father, will testify about me to you and help you to testify about me to others, but will defend you as well, will give you an understanding of how to deal with the things the world throws against you, and what to do, so that, like the vine, you can produce more better fruit. And yeah, basically, that's the correspondence of plants, the correspondence of grapevines.
Yeah,
right?
Thank you. I just want to share one thought, and I'm going to go back to that section you just referred to about the world hating you. Here it is. Verse 18, if the world hates you, you know it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. It just strikes me that so many people can look at those words and it creates an enemy out there.
Yeah.
You know, so we get an us and a them mentality, and I don't think that's what the Lord intends here, is it? There's two attitudes that both exist within us, and he's really presenting the opportunity to choose one over the other. Would you agree?
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes. The battle is outside of us against the world, and within us against ourselves. The same battle, and it is, to put it bluntly, why we are left in the world.
So how do those two battles interrelate? How does the battle with the world out there relate to the battle with the world in me? Is it that the world out there presents for me the challenges within myself that I must overcome?
Yeah, the way I most often think of it, David, is it strengthens the decisions that I make. So if I can make a decision to do something, but never do it. But if I make a decision to do it and then start to do it, that is when the world will start to oppose me. And if I give up, then once again, that decision is never made. It's never kept. But if I keep going against the odds and against the opposition, the more I keep going, the more I change. And that is what this world is for. It's like I say, it's like preparing for the performance,
Mm.
the practice, and all the other things that you do. It's like Paul talks about it in another place. He said it's like a soldier who practices how to defend himself and how to defend his country.
Mm.
But of course, he will never know whether that practice was adequate until he gets into the battle. And then when he gets into the battle, he will realize where his weaknesses are, and what he needs to go back and practice more. And that's really what it is in a nutshell. That's what salvation is in a nutshell. And one of the things I think is very important to say is that in so many churches, so many Christians today do not think that doing good, that doing works, as it were, are important. But works are the battle. Doing your works and doing your good and doing what God has told you to do is the actual battle. And until you've fought that battle, in a sense, you've got nothing.
Yeah. So the physical world kind of grounds all of this process, doesn't it? It's the foundation for all of this. It's the reality. If we were just fighting the battle in our own head, it would kind of be easier.
Exactly.
But it's got to be grounded in reality.
Got to be out there. We've got to put it out there. We've got to make it happen. Yeah. And it's interesting that more and more these days people are talking about, the North Star and having a dream and, just turning your goals into reality.
Yeah. Another thing it just makes me think about, I was thinking about it a little earlier today too, in our session, was our perception of the world is not the world.
Right.
So we can get a sense of what the world is, but in actual fact, what we tend to do often is project on the world and see out there something that really exists within us. I always talk about the experience if you drive a particular car and suddenly you see that car on the road everywhere.
Yeah.
Because there's something that you relate to, which you suddenly see. It's not as though everybody went out and bought those cars. They were always there. It's just suddenly you notice them.
Yeah.
And I think that's true also of, I had a teacher in, going back when I was a teenager, teaching me a musical instrument who said that he was most acutely aware of the things in other players that he was the worst at.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what we often see out in the world, that the opposition we kind of project out there in a way.
Yeah.
And part of the use of that, as we've talked about, is this grounding of the struggle in something physical and something real. That becomes our battleground, I suppose.
Yeah. I have this thing when I meet young people. They say to me, well, what do you think is the most important thing to do in life? And I say to them, I think the most important thing to do in life is to prove that you're a man of your word. It's not enough just to say something. It's not enough to be thought well of, to be kind and good and helpful, kind and good, and have a reputation, for being a great guy. You have to build a reputation which is based on doing what you say.
Yeah.
And it's literally as simple as that.
Yeah. Put your money where your mouth is, as they say.
Money where your mouth is, yeah. And even though it doesn't sound like that's a deep spiritual truth, that's probably the deepest spiritual truth.
It's a great reality that
it explains, not least because it explains why we're here.
Yeah, yeah. I will say shout out to Wayne. Hello, joining us from the UK. So goodness me, it's got to be midnight or something over there at the moment. I don't. But good to have you here, mate. And hope you enjoy the recording when you get to rewatch it. Look, we're coming up on our hour, so I think it's probably time for us to sign off. I think. Is there anything last comments you want to make, Martin, before we do?
No, I think that about sums it up, Dave.
Oh, cool. Well, look, thanks for guiding us through the chapter.
When do you think we'll have another opportunity to do this?
Now, that is a good question.
You're going on holidays, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm about to go on leave, spend some time in Alice Springs, which we're very much looking forward to. So it'll be a few weeks off. I think you and I will probably have a chat about that offline,
Yeah.
and then we'll figure out something. But look, if you're watching and you want to know our next opportunity to do this, just keep an eye on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel. Oh, 6 in the morning, Wayne says. There you go. Right and early. I was doing my sums the wrong way. That's right. Yeah, look, keep an eye on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and we'll pop something up there. And the other thing I'll mention too, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, sign up to our weekly update. We have a weekly newsletter that comes out that tells you everything that's going on in the week ahead. It comes out on a Wednesday, and that will just keep you abreast of all developments on Swedenborg Community Victoria. Thanks, Martin. It's been good to have you here. Thanks everybody who's been watching and contributed online, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.